September 8, 1943, near Rome. The Italian soldier in front of you is wearing the same uniform as the man standing beside him. Both carry rifles. Both were trained by the same army. Both believed, until yesterday, that they knew who their enemies were. By tonight, one may be ordered to shoot the other. The terrifying part is not that Italy changed sides. It is that, for thousands of soldiers, nobody clearly explained when the change happened. For 3 years, Italy had fought beside Germany. Its soldiers had marched through France, Greece, Yugoslavia, and North Africa beneath the same national insignia. They had shared battlefields with German units, depended on German supplies, and learned to recognize Allied aircraft as something to fear. Then, in a matter of hours, the political world above them shifted, and the men carrying rifles discovered that loyalty could become obsolete before the uniform change. This is the story of what happens when an army survives a political collapse without receiving a clear command. It is not simply a story about betrayal. It is about logistics, information, fear, and the brutal machinery of war. Because when governments change sides, soldiers do not receive a new identity overnight. They still have the same boots, the same training, the same memories, and often the same people standing across the road. To understand the shock of 1943, you have to go back to the beginning. In June 1940, Benito Mussolini brought Italy into the Second World War against Britain and France. The decision was made at the highest level, but its consequences traveled downward into barracks, workshops, ports, and farms. Young men were mobilized, trained, equipped, and sent into a war whose objectives were usually defined by politicians far from the front. At first, the campaign looked like an opportunity to build an empire, but ambition quickly collided with the industrial reality. Italy had a large army, yet its military system struggled with shortages of fuel, modern vehicles, artillery, aircraft, and raw materials. Numbers on paper could not automatically become combat power in the field. An army could possess thousands of trucks and still be unable to move an army if those trucks lacked fuel or spare parts. That distinction would become crucial. In Greece, Italian forces encountered fierce resistance and struggled to achieve the rapid victory expected from Rome. Germany eventually intervened in the Balkans, rescuing an Italian campaign that had exposed the weakness between political ambition and military capacity. Italian troops were then drawn into occupation duties, counterinsurgency, and increasingly complicated campaigns across the Mediterranean. The war became a system of dependencies. Italian units relied on German coordination in some theaters. German formations relied on Italian ports, roads, and manpower. Allied commanders understood that destroying transport could be as important as defeating soldiers. Fuel became a weapon. Shipping became a battlefield. Every tank or truck operating in North Africa depended on an enormous chain stretching across the Mediterranean. Then came 1942. The Axis advance in North Africa reached its high point, but the appearance of success concealed a growing structural problem. The farther German and Italian forces moved east, the longer their supply lines became. British forces regrouped. American resources entered the Mediterranean War in increasing strength. At El Alamein, the Axis position began to unravel. Retreat turned roads into graveyards of abandoned vehicles. Men who had advanced behind armored columns now watched machinery become useless because there was nothing left to put into its fuel tanks. The military crisis soon became a political one. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Mussolini's position collapsed. He was removed from power and arrested. Marshal Pietro Badoglio took control of the Italian government. Publicly, Italy remained aligned with Germany. Privately, negotiations with the Allies moved toward an armistice. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. The government knew it was changing direction. The soldiers did not know when, how, or what they were supposed to do afterward. On September 8th, the armistice was announced. For civilians, it sounded like the war was ending. For Italian soldiers, it created a vacuum. Orders were confused. Communications were unreliable, and German forces already positioned across Italy began preparing to disarm their former allies. A soldier could wake up believing the Germans were partners and go to sleep knowing they might be the enemy. But there was one problem nobody could solve with a speech. An army needs orders before it can change sides. And when those orders fail to arrive, every checkpoint becomes a question. Do you surrender, resist, obey the officer beside you, or wait for someone higher to decide? In the silence between commands, an ordinary soldier can become a prisoner, a fugitive, or an enemy without moving even 100 yards from his original post. By the morning after the armistice, the Italian military was no longer functioning as a single machine. Some units surrendered to German forces, others resisted. Some commanders attempted to move south toward territory controlled by the new government. Thousands simply disappeared into civilian life. The collapse was not clean because armies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They fragment. A battalion loses its headquarters. A radio stops transmitting. An officer leaves to find orders and never returns. Soldiers begin making decisions with incomplete information. For Germany, the uncertainty created an opportunity. German forces moved rapidly to seize Italian airfields, ports, roads, railways, and military installations. Their objective was not merely to defeat Italian soldiers. They wanted to control the territory before the Allies could move north. Weapons were collected. Units were surrounded. Officers were pressured to surrender. In many places, Italian resistance was brief. In others, fighting broke out. The strategic logic was brutally simple. Germany could not afford to leave a former ally with hundreds of thousands of armed men behind its lines. Italy's sudden defection threatened German access to the Mediterranean and opened the possibility of an Allied advance through the peninsula. So German planners treated Italian disarmament as an urgent military operation. For the Italian soldier, however, the mathematics looked completely different. The enemy he had been trained to fight was still across the sea. The men who suddenly demanded his rifle had recently been described as comrades. The government that had sent him to war was giving contradictory signals, and the country itself was becoming a battlefield. Some soldiers chose resistance. Others believed surrender was the only way to survive. Tens of thousands were captured and transported to German-controlled territory as military internees. Many were sent to labor camps or held under harsh conditions. Their predicament exposed another uncomfortable truth about war. Once a soldier loses the protection of a functioning state, his uniform may no longer protect him. But the collapse also created something unexpected. Italy began fighting Germany from within. The Southern government, now aligned with the Allies, gradually rebuilt Italian military forces. Italian units became co-belligerents, fighting alongside Allied armies against German forces. At the same time, partisan groups formed or expanded behind German lines. Former soldiers, political opponents of fascism, civilians, workers, monarchists, communists, socialists, and others joined the resistance for different reasons. There was no single Italian resistance with one ideology or one chain of command. It was a patchwork. That made it difficult to control, but also difficult to destroy. And the transformation of the Italian soldier was even more complicated. Imagine having spent years learning that a particular insignia represented your nation, your duty, and your comrades. Then imagine removing that insignia and replacing it with another while the memories underneath remain exactly the same. The weapon changes. The political language changes. The strategic objective changes. But the human being holding the rifle does not. This is why Italy's 1943 collapse matters beyond military history. It reveals how fragile loyalty becomes when institutions stop agreeing with themselves. The battlefield in Italy soon reflected that fracture. German forces established defensive lines across the peninsula, exploiting mountains, rivers, demolished bridges, and narrow roads. Allied armies advanced from the south, but geography turned every kilometer into a struggle. The Italian campaign was not a simple march toward Rome. It became a grinding contest in which terrain multiplied the power of defenders. At Monte Cassino, The Allies faced one of the most difficult obstacles of the campaign. The monastery and surrounding mountains became symbols of the problem. Even when an army possesses overwhelming resources, mountains can turn movement into attrition. Roads narrow, vehicles struggle, artillery becomes harder to position, weather becomes an enemy of its own. Meanwhile, behind the front, the resistance fought a different war. A partisan did not need to destroy an entire German formation. Cutting a telephone line, damaging a vehicle, passing information, hiding an escaped prisoner, or delaying a convoy could create a small disruption. Repeated thousands of times, those disruptions became strategically significant, but resistance had a price. German and fascist forces responded with arrests, reprisals, executions, and destruction of communities suspected of supporting partisans. Civilians were trapped between competing armed groups. The distinction between battlefield and home disappeared. And for Italian soldiers who had once fought beside Germans, the psychological reversal could be even harder. They knew how German units operated. They knew their weapons, habits, vehicles, and tactics. That knowledge could now become useful against the men they had previously called allies. The most unsettling transformation was not learning how to fight a new enemy. It was realizing that the enemy had not changed nearly as much as the meaning attached to him. The uniform had changed sides, but memory refused to follow the order completely. By 1944, the Italian campaign had become a war of contradictions. Italian soldiers were now fighting German troops, but some of those German troops had once shared their trenches, transport routes, meals, and headquarters. Former allies could recognize one another across a battlefield. They understood the same weapons, remembered the same campaigns, and sometimes knew exactly how the other side would move. That familiarity created an unusual kind of warfare. The Italian government needed to prove that it was no longer simply a defeated Axis power. It wanted recognition as a legitimate partner in the Allied war effort. Italian forces were therefore reorganized, retrained, and equipped for combat against Germany. Their numbers and capabilities were limited compared with the massive Allied armies, but their political importance was greater than their size suggested. For Italy, fighting Germany was also a fight for the country's future. Every successful operation could demonstrate that Italy was more than the dictatorship that had entered the war 4 years earlier. Every failure could reinforce the belief that the country was weak, divided, and incapable of controlling its own destiny. But political symbolism did not make combat easier. Italian units still faced mountains, artillery, mines, winter weather, and German defensive positions. The Gothic Line in northern Italy became another formidable barrier. German forces used prepared fortifications and difficult terrain to slow the Allied advance. Progress was measured in villages, bridges, ridges, and roads rather than hundreds of kilometers. Meanwhile, the resistance continued operating behind German lines. Its greatest advantage was information. Partisans knew the roads. They knew which families could hide fugitives and which villages were being watched. They understood local terrain in ways that conventional armies could not replicate. Yet every advantage carried danger. A single informant could expose an entire network. A failed sabotage operation could trigger arrests. A message delivered too late could turn an escape route into a trap. The resistance also faced a problem that rarely appears on simplified maps of the war. It had enemies on multiple sides. German occupation forces were the most obvious threat, but Italian fascist forces supporting the German-backed Italian Social Republic were also fighting against the resistance. This turned the conflict into a civil war layer on top of the larger Allied German war. Italy was no longer simply divided between two countries. It was divided within itself. Families could disagree over politics. Former soldiers could become partisans. Former fascists could surrender and later claim they had always opposed Mussolini. Civilians could cooperate with one side because they feared the other. Survival itself could look like political allegiance. This is where the story of the Italian soldier becomes larger than one battlefield. A uniform is supposed to simplify identity. It tells everyone who you serve. It distinguishes friend from enemy. It gives a soldier a place inside a hierarchy. But Italy demonstrated what happens when the hierarchy breaks. A soldier could wear an Italian uniform while serving a government recognized by the Allies. Another Italian could wear a different uniform while serving Mussolini's German-backed republic. A partisan might wear almost nothing recognizable as military clothing. A German soldier might be standing beside one Italian today and fighting another tomorrow. The symbols became unreliable. Behavior became the only evidence. In June 1944, Allied forces entered Rome. The liberation was a major psychological victory, but it did not end the war. German forces withdrew northward, and the fighting continued. For civilians who had lived under occupation, liberation brought relief, but it also revealed the scale of destruction left behind. The Italian campaign would continue for almost another year. That length matters because it changed the meaning of survival. At the beginning of the war, many soldiers imagined a short campaign followed by homecoming. By 1944, that expectation had disappeared. Men had spent years moving between countries, armies, governments, and battlefields. Some had lost friends in campaigns whose political purpose they no longer understood. And still, the machinery continued. Supplies arrived, vehicles moved, artillery fired, orders were transmitted, replacements filled empty positions. War possesses a terrifying ability to continue even after the people inside it have stopped believing in the original reason for fighting. Then, in early 1945, the balance finally shifted decisively. Allied forces prepared their final offensive in northern Italy. German positions were attacked across multiple sectors. Partisan uprisings expanded as German authority weakened. Cities began slipping from fascist control. The political structure that had survived through repression, German protection, and military force was approaching its end. Mussolini attempted to flee north. He did not make it. Italian partisans captured him in April 1945. He was executed shortly afterward. Within days, German forces in Italy surrendered, with the surrender becoming effective on May 2nd. For the Italian soldier, who had survived since 1940, the war was suddenly over. But victory created a question that battle could not answer. What exactly had he been fighting for? 5 years earlier, the answer had seemed obvious. There was a government. There was a uniform. There was an enemy. There were orders. Now the government had changed. The alliance had reversed. The dictatorship was gone. And the same country contained veterans who had fought on opposite sides. The battlefield had finally stopped moving. The identity crisis had not. The hardest part of a political collapse is not losing a battle. It is discovering that the story you were given about the battle may no longer make sense. For the Italian soldier who survived 1945, the war did not end when the guns became silent. It continued in memory, in politics, in families, and in the question of responsibility. Italy now had to rebuild itself while carrying the weight of its recent past. The monarchy would eventually disappear after the 1946 referendum, and the country became a republic. Former fascists, former partisans, veterans, prisoners, civilians, and victims had to live in the same cities again. There was no simple national agreement about what should be remembered, punished, forgiven, or forgotten. The physical war had destroyed bridges, factories, railways, homes, and roads. The political war had damaged trust. People had learned to survive by adapting quickly. Some had collaborated because they believed in fascism. Others had collaborated because they were afraid. Some resisted from conviction. Others resisted because occupation had made neutrality impossible. The same action could look heroic from one perspective and shameful from another. This is why judging an individual soldier only by the uniform he wore can be dangerously misleading. A uniform tells you where a person stood within a system at one particular moment. It does not tell you what information he possessed, what orders he received, what alternatives existed, or what happened after the system itself changed. A man could begin the war fighting against Britain, later fight against Germany, and still regard himself as serving Italy throughout. Another could remain loyal to Mussolini after the government changed sides. Another could refuse both choices and disappear into civilian life. None of those decisions occurred inside a vacuum. Each was shaped by fear, family, geography, information, ideology, and the immediate possibility of death. Institutions are systems of coordination. Armies coordinate people through commands, logistics, ranks, communications, and shared expectations. Businesses do something remarkably similar. A company can have thousands of employees and enormous resources. But if information stops moving, priorities conflict, and leadership sends contradictory signals, the organization can become dysfunctional surprisingly quickly. The country possessed soldiers, factories, ports, railways, commanders, and weapons. What it temporarily lacked was coordinated direction. The result was not merely inefficiency, it was fragmentation. This is why logistics mattered so much. Fuel shortages did not simply slow tanks, they changed strategic possibilities. Broken communications did not merely inconvenience commanders, they created uncertainty that could become fatal. Conflicting orders did not merely confuse soldiers, they forced individuals to make decisions that should have belonged to institutions. Complex systems fail at their weakest points, especially when the people inside them cannot tell whether the rules have changed. The uniform was never the real source of loyalty. It was a visible symbol of a much larger system: government, nation, command, ideology, and belonging. When those elements moved in different directions, the fabric remained intact while the meaning inside it collapsed. For thousands of Italians, the most frightening moment was therefore not necessarily the first time they fought German soldiers. That uncertainty produced prisoners, fugitives, partisans, collaborators, and new soldiers. It separated families. It forced men to reinterpret years of service while bullets were still flying. And it showed how quickly an apparently permanent political order can become temporary. The story explains why historical memory is rarely clean. After the war, people naturally wanted categories: hero, traitor, victim, collaborator, resistor. But real lives often cross those boundaries. A soldier could obey one order and later reject another. Someone could support a government and still protect a civilian. Someone could fight bravely for a cause and later realize the cause was morally indefensible. The Italian soldier who changed enemies without changing nationality therefore represents something larger than one country's wartime crisis. He represents the human being trapped between institutions when institutions themselves disagree. That is the final irony of this story. The men who once stood beside Germany did not become different people when Germany became their enemy. They carried the same wounds, the same friendships, the same fears, and the same years of experience into the new war. The battlefield changed faster than they could, and perhaps that is the most important lesson. Loyalty feels permanent when the system around you is stable. It feels obvious when everyone agrees. But history repeatedly proves that institutions can reverse direction almost overnight, leaving ordinary people to navigate consequences created far above their heads. A soldier can be ordered to change sides. He cannot be ordered to forget where he stood yesterday. That is what makes this story so haunting. The uniform tells us which army a man belonged to. His memories tell us what that belonging cost him. And sometimes, when history asks which side you were on, the most honest answer is not a flag. It is the story of how the world changed while you were still wearing the same uniform. If this story changed the way you see war, loyalty, and the people trapped between them, subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the decisions hidden behind history's biggest turning points. Because history is rarely as simple as heroes and enemies. Sometimes, the uniform stays the same while everything it once represented falls apart. And now the question is yours. If your government changed sides overnight, but your orders remained unclear, would you obey, resist, or choose your own path? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe, because the next story may reveal another moment when the world changed faster than the people living through it.